Before the American daylight bombing campaign became a clean line in a history book, it was a living machine that ate people for fuel. In early 1944, the 8th Air Force was trying to do something no air arm had ever done at that scale. Fly heavy bombers deep into enemy territory in broad daylight, hold formation under flak, endure fighter attacks, drop bombs with mathematical precision, and then fly the same long corridor back out again. On paper, it looked like industry versus industry, production numbers, sortie rates, targets destroyed. In the air, it looked like aluminum skin trembling at -40 degrees, men breathing through rubber masks, and the sky itself turning hostile. The idea was simple: crush the factories, cripple the rail lines, break the fuel supply, and you break the war machine. The reality was that the war machine fought back with everything it had: anti-aircraft guns that could put a timed burst at bomber altitude like a trap laid in the air, and fighter pilots who understood the geometry of a bomber stream as intimately as a butcher understands joints. If you want to understand what that war felt like, don't start with the bombs. Start with the fear that lives in the last seat of a B-17, because from that seat you see the attack forming before anyone else, and you understand, seconds before the first burst hits, that survival is never guaranteed, only negotiated. That's where our story begins. March 6th, 1944, about 23,000 feet over Germany, in the tailgun position of a B-17 flying fortress, where a man could watch the enemy gather like a storm and decide, in the span of a few heartbeats, whether he would follow the book or rewrite it. The airplane itself was a contradiction. The B-17 was called a flying fortress because it bristled with guns, but it was still a large, relatively slow machine that survived only because hundreds of similar machines flew together, weaving overlapping fields of fire into a defensive lattice. Alone, a bomber was a target. In formation, it became a moving city of guns. That was the theory. The catch was that bombing required stability. When the formation reached the bomb run, pilots had to fly straight and level so the bomb sight could do its work. No evasive jinks, no sudden dives, no wild turns. For several minutes at a time, a B-17 became a predictable object moving along a predictable path at a predictable altitude. Exactly the kind of object flak crews loved and fighter pilots studied. Flak was not luck. It was math applied violently. German gunners didn't try to hit the airplane the way someone throws a rock at a bird. They fired shells set to burst at a calculated point in space, where the bomber would be when the fuse burned down. If you flew into the calculation, the sky exploded beside you. The bomber crew rarely heard the blast the way a man on the ground hears artillery. At 23,000 feet, with 4 engines roaring and the aircraft knifing through thin air, sound arrived oddly, muted and delayed. But the body felt it immediately. A sudden punch in the airframe, metal ringing like a struck bell, teeth clacking, a vibration that ran through ribs and spine. Each burst was a question asked in steel. Is this the one with your name on it? The fighters were different. Fighters were personal. You could see them coming. You could watch them organize. You could watch the way they moved, confident, disciplined, predatory. A heavy bomber's worst enemy wasn't necessarily a lone fighter diving in for glory. It was a coordinated group executing a practiced pattern. German fighters liked to attack from the stern quarter and from high six because those angles threatened control surfaces and forced gunners into difficult tracking arcs. A clean pass could shred the tail, snap control cables, and leave the bomber unable to hold attitude. And the most vulnerable part of that entire machine, the part that could turn a flying fortress into a falling coffin, was the tail. The tail held the rudder and elevators. The tail held the aircraft's authority to say no to gravity. That's why the tail gunner had the worst seat in the house. He sat alone at the back of the airplane in a cramped, glassy compartment, a bubble of plexiglass and metal with two 50-caliber guns and a narrow view behind him. He was separated from the rest of the crew by bulkheads and distance and noise. When the bomber shuddered, he felt it first. When fighters formed behind, he saw them first. And if the tail took a burst, he would often be the first to know that the aircraft's survival had just become a countdown. The tail gunner that day was a staff sergeant named Michael Donovan, Mike to the crew. Not a polished hero, not a man built for parades. He was built for endurance and reaction. He came out of a working-class neighborhood where the rules of safety were learned the hard way, young and permanently. Don't wait for the other guy to decide the moment. If you let the attacker set the timing, you've already surrendered your best advantage, which is surprise. That instinct did not fit neatly into the Air Force's early bomber gunnery doctrine. In training, they taught conservation and discipline. Fire short bursts. Wait for effective range. Don't waste ammunition on long shots. Don't reveal your position. Don't expose yourself to return fire until you can make hits count. Instructors called that professionalism. Donovan heard something else: delay. And in combat, delay can be fatal. Because the bomber war wasn't a fair exchange at medium range. Fighters chose when to engage. Fighters chose the angle. Fighters chose the tempo. The gunner's job was to survive long enough to react, and too often that meant reacting after the attacker had already created the perfect conditions to kill you. Donovan had already flown enough to understand what happened when a crew tried to do everything right. He'd seen bombers return with neat rows of holes that looked almost orderly, as if the aircraft had been punched through by a machine. He'd seen the ugly, panicked repairs on the hard stand, tail sections patched, control lines checked and rechecked, gunners staring at their own positions the way a man stares at a dangerous corner in a dark alley. He'd also seen what didn't come back. In the bomber war, absence was the most common form of death. An airplane simply wasn't there when the formation reassembled over the coast. A position on the dispersal line stayed empty. A crew chief waited for an engine sound that never arrived. In briefings, they spoke about losses in numbers because numbers were bearable. In the barracks, men spoke about losses in silence because names were not. In the days leading up to March 6th, Donovan had begun experimenting with a simple idea that felt wrong to traditionalists and reckless to officers. You don't wait for fighters to commit to a run. You attack them while they are still building the run. That phase, when fighters gather at distance, sliding into echelon positions, aligning for a dive, is the moment their coordination is most fragile. It's also the moment bomber gunners were taught to ignore because it was too far. Donovan didn't care about the manual's comfort. He cared about disrupting the enemy's comfort. He'd fired early before, at ranges like 1-800 or 2,000 yards where hit probability was low, and he'd watched a formation scatter anyway. The rounds didn't need to hit to change behavior. Tracers were messages written in light. They said, "This tail isn't sleeping. This tail is willing to fight." And that message forced German pilots to make a decision earlier than they wanted, and earlier decisions are almost always worse decisions because they're made before the plan is fully formed. A crew chief had confronted Donovan after one of those missions, furious at the ammunition expenditure. Donovan's answer was ice cold. "Ammunition is heavy," he said, "but men are heavier. If 20 rounds at long range make fighters break and reform, you've just bought minutes of safety for 9 lives. The math works even if the bullets never touch the target." March 6th was the day the math would be tested under maximum pressure. The B-17 climbed into the bomber stream, joining hundreds of aircraft assembling over England like a slow-moving armada. From a distance, the formation looked invincible, so many airplanes that the sky seemed crowded. From inside, it felt fragile, held together by discipline and fear. Men spoke in clipped phrases and routine call-outs because routine was armor. At altitude, the cold became total. Hands numbed, faces tightened under oxygen masks. The world outside the tail bubble was a hard, bright emptiness that offered no comfort. When the bomber stream crossed the channel, the psychological line was crossed too. Behind them was home, ahead of them was enemy airspace, and between those two places was a corridor where the air itself tried to kill you. As they entered Germany, flak began to appear, first as distant puffs, then as bursts closer in, then as a thickening field of black detonations. You could see the shells burst like dark flowers, each one a sphere of violence expanding in the thin air. Sometimes they were far enough away to be merely threatening. Sometimes they were close enough to jolt the aircraft and make every man freeze, not because he had time to panic, but because his body recognized a shock as danger. A burst nearby didn't just tear metal, it shook confidence. It reminded crews that no matter how many guns they carried, they were still flying through a place where the enemy could put an explosion beside them on purpose. On the bomb run, when the pilots had to keep the airplane steady, flak felt like torture because your instincts screamed to maneuver and your duty ordered you to remain predictable. Then Donovan saw the dots, 12 at 6 o'clock high, forming up. Messerschmitt Bf earnings, disciplined and patient, building the attack the way a craftsman builds a tool. They weren't diving yet, they were positioning. They were preparing to do what German fighters did best: coordinate, commit, and overwhelm the bomber's defenses through timing. Standard doctrine said the tail gunner should wait until they were within effective range. Wait until the silhouettes filled the sight ring, then fire controlled bursts at the lead aircraft. Training said conserve ammunition. Common sense said stay alive. Donovan's instinct said something different. If you let them finish organizing, you're already late. He opened fire immediately. At roughly 2,000 yards, the tracers arced through a lot of empty sky. Many rounds missed by dozens of feet, but the effect was immediate and real. The lead fighter broke right. Wingmen hesitated. The clean echelon pattern wobbled. That wobble mattered because coordination is a chain, and a chain is only strong while every link holds. If one pilot breaks too early, the rest must adjust, and adjustment steals precious seconds from the attack run. Those seconds are the bomber's life. In the cockpit, the pilot's voice cracked over intercom, sharp, irritated, worried about ammunition and discipline. Donovan didn't argue like a rookie. He answered like a man who understood the rhythm better than the manual did. Negative, sir. Watch what happens next. The fighters pulled out and regrouped farther back. Now they approached cautiously instead of confidently, probing instead of committing. Donovan had done something subtle. He had shifted initiative. The attacker wants the defender to react. Donovan was forcing the attacker to react to him. When the next approach began, Donovan didn't chase the nearest aircraft. He watched the formation like a street fight. Not the man throwing the loudest punch, but the one about to slip in behind it. In coordinated attacks, wingmen often rely on the defender's fixation. A gunner tracks the lead threat. The wingman exploits the gunner's tunnel vision. Donovan aimed to break that logic. As the range closed, 1,500 yards, 1,300, he held his fire, letting them believe they could reset their rhythm. At roughly 700 yards, When the fighter shape grew large enough to feel real, he fired a sustained barrage not to spray, but to build a wall in the fighter's path. A wingman held course longer than expected, experienced, aggressive, not easily intimidated. Donovan let it close a little more, then poured the stream directly into the flight path. The fighter tried to brake, but crossed through the tracer line. In the tail bubble, Donovan saw a flash near the engine line and then smoke. Not a cinematic fireball, a violent stutter, a machine losing coherence. The fighter rolled away and dropped, and the rest of the formation suddenly had to reconcile a new truth. The tail wasn't playing defense anymore. The remaining fighters adapted quickly, and this is where the bomber war becomes brutally honest. Once the enemy knows you're dangerous, they stop offering you simple shots. They split into angles designed to overload you. They come in from different quarters to force you to choose. And choosing wrong can cost the aircraft in seconds. Donovan refused to be trapped into covering everything. He committed to the most lethal vector, the direct stern approach that threatened tail controls, and trusted the waist gunners to take the off-angle attackers. It feels insane to ignore a fighter, but the alternative is worse. Track two threats poorly and allow both to complete their runs. In bomber defense, there are moments when focus is the only form of survival. The stern group dove, and time compressed into a handful of seconds. Closing speed between a bomber and a fighter is brutally fast. The distance between "they're out there" and "they can fire" collapses quicker than the human mind wants to accept. Donovan fired early enough to force decisions, 800 yards, then shorter, walking tracers into the path so that the attacker had to either brake and lose geometry or hold and risk hits. The lead pilot held longer than he should have. That's the thing about confidence. It convinces you the other guy will flinch first. Donovan didn't flinch. Rounds found metal. The fighter jerked, rolled, and fell away trailing smoke. The next pilot saw that wall of fire and broke off. The run collapsed. Again, Donovan hadn't just scored damage. He'd prevented a clean pass, and preventing a pass is the difference between coming home and becoming smoke. But the cost was ticking down in the ammo boxes. Donovan could feel it without looking because gunners develop a sixth sense for diminishing belts. Every burst is a decision you can't undo, and the mission was far from over. The stream still had to reach the target, still had to fly straight for the bomb site, still had to cross that corridor back out. The fighters knew this too. They didn't need to win in one attack. They only needed one successful pass at the right moment. If you're getting value from stories like this, stories that put you inside the machine of war and show what the numbers on a chart actually felt like, take a second right now to hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you think, because it tells the algorithm that you want history told with detail, not just dates. And drop a comment with where you're watching from, because I read them and I use them to decide which battles and missions we reconstruct next. As the formation pressed deeper, flak intensified, and fatigue began to accumulate in a way that no training could fully simulate. The cold doesn't just hurt. It steals dexterity. The oxygen doesn't just keep you alive. It dries you out and makes your throat feel like sandpaper. The noise doesn't just irritate. It wears grooves into your concentration. You can perform at a high level for minutes under terror, but performing for hours is something else. It's a slow erosion. And erosion is what kills crews on the way home, when reactions slow by a fraction, when a man's hands hesitate for a moment, when the aircraft drifts a few degrees off position and becomes a slightly easier target. A flak burst rocked the bomber hard enough that the entire tail section seemed to shiver. Somewhere forward, a voice reported a control issue. Rudder response heavy, sluggish, not catastrophic yet. For a tail gunner, those words land like a sentence. Sluggish becomes stuck. Stuck becomes uncontrolled yaw. Uncontrolled yaw becomes formation separation. Separation becomes isolation. Isolation becomes death. Because the bomber stream's greatest protection is overlap, and overlap collapses with distance. A B-17 slightly out of position isn't just a little alone. It's suddenly the one aircraft the enemy can surround without paying the full price of the formation's lattice. The fighters noticed. A new group formed farther back, shadowing outside range, waiting for the bomber to drift just enough to become the low-hanging fruit. Donovan checked his remaining ammunition and felt the familiar dread. You can't intimidate forever if you can't fire. He had to change again, from aggression by volume to aggression by timing. He fired tighter bursts designed to force break-offs rather than chase kills. He targeted the moment of commitment, the last seconds when a fighter wants to hold course because the shot window is opening. If you can make a pilot break in that moment, you steal his run and you steal his confidence. And confidence is everything in fighter attacks because a coordinated stern run requires nerve. It requires a pilot to believe the gunner will hesitate or waste his fire. Donovan's whole method was built to destroy that belief. When the bomb run began, the aircraft had to fly straight, and that straightness is what makes the experience feel like you're being executed slowly. You see flak bursts ahead. You know the aircraft will fly through that air anyway. You can't duck. You can't flinch the plane. You can only hold your breath and hope the math is slightly off. Bomb bay doors open. The bomber shudders. The stream becomes even more predictable. That's when fighter pilots love to strike, because bombers are locked into their path. But an active tail changes the cost of that strike. A fighter can approach a quiet bomber with confidence. Approaching a bomber whose tail has already forced multiple aborts is something else. Now the pilot must calculate not only geometry, but risk, and risk feels heavier after you've seen a wingman fall. When the bombs finally dropped, bombs away, the crew didn't cheer. In the air war, bombs away doesn't mean victory. It means the point of no return has passed, and now you must make it home through the same gauntlet. The aircraft felt lighter in a physical sense, but psychologically, the heaviest part began. The long withdrawal, the hours of being hunted while tired. It's on the way out that men realize how much fear they've been storing in their bodies. It's on the way out that a single break in formation can become a death warrant. On the return leg, Donovan used what he had left not just as ammunition, but as theater. That sounds ridiculous until you understand how fear works at speed. He tracked approaching fighters with disciplined, steady movement, barrels aligned precisely with cockpits, as if he had unlimited belts. After a day of early fire and disrupted runs, the enemy pilots had learned a lesson without needing assigned confirmation. This tail is dangerous, and fear doesn't require certainty. It only requires possibility. A pilot doesn't need to know you have 300 rounds. He only needs to believe you might have enough to make the next 7 seconds fatal. A fighter probed, then drifted outward. Another approached, then hesitated. None wanted to be the one to discover, too late, that the guns were still live. Hours later, when the B-17 finally returned to England and the wheels hit the runway, the ground felt impossible in its stillness. Engines shut down. The roar died. Silence arrived like something solid. Ground crews swarmed in, counting damage because damage is the honest record of what happened. They found flak fragments embedded in aluminum. They found stress marks and torn metal along the tail section. They found the kind of wounds that say, you were one clean pass away from not existing. Then they opened the ammunition boxes and saw how close the crew had come to the edge. Whether the legend later became 12 fighters in 4 minutes or some other number, the material truth was right there. The tail had fired hard, early and often, and the bomber had lived. That night, in barracks and mess halls, the story began to grow the way all wartime stories grow. Men crave numbers because numbers feel like control. How many fighters? How many minutes? How many rounds? How many seconds between seeing the dots and feeling the airframe shudder? Someone said 12 in 4 minutes. Someone else tightened the timing. Someone else added more attackers, more break-offs, more drama. Myth is not always a lie. Sometimes it is a human attempt to compress chaos into something the mind can hold. But beneath the myth was a truth that didn't need inflation. Aggression at the formation phase changed the shape of the fight. It forced attackers to hesitate. It disrupted coordinated runs. It prevented clean passes. And in the bomber war, prevention is survival. Afterward, what matters isn't one gunner's legend. It's how a concept spreads. Commanders don't scale legends. They scale behaviors. If multiple crews report that fighters are breaking early when tails engage at long range, if attack completion drops when gunners disrupt formation phase, if bombers return with fewer stern quarter strikes, that becomes a lesson worth teaching. The bomber war was not won by a single perfect shot. It was won by small shifts repeated across thousands of sorties. It was won by turning the enemy's confident plan into an uncertain gamble, and making him decide that other targets were easier, cheaper, less terrifying. There is nothing romantic about a B-17 over Germany in 1944. It is cold in a way that hurts the bones. It is loud in a way that drains the brain. It is cramped in a way that makes men feel like they're sealed inside a machine designed to fail. Flak turns the air into timed explosions. Fighters turn the sky behind you into a hunting ground measured in seconds. When crews die, it isn't cinematic. It is an absence, an empty hardstand, a missing aircraft, a letter written with words that never capture what it feels like to watch 12 dots become 12 aircraft, to hear fighters 6 o'clock high, and to know you're about to experience 4 minutes that may decide whether you ever touch ground again. That is why the tail gunner's decision matters. Not because it makes war noble, it doesn't. Not because it makes killing clean, it never is. It matters because it reveals something brutally practical. In a fight where the attacker wants the initiative, stealing initiative can be the only form of defense that actually works. Defensive doctrine assumes you can endure the enemy's timing. Aggressive defense tries to destroy the timing before it becomes a dive. It tries to force the attacker into hesitation, and hesitation is where coordinated violence dies. So whether the numbers were exactly as the legend later claimed, the lesson remains as sharp as the flak that day. Sometimes the safest place in the sky is the place where the enemy believes you are most dangerous, and sometimes survival is not about hiding behind doctrine. It's about refusing to wait for death to arrive on its own schedule. You act, you disrupt, you force the attacker to reconsider, and you buy your crew the most precious resource in the bomber war: seconds. If you want more WP reconstructions like this, air war, naval battles, tank ambushes, resistance operations, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story can go even deeper into the details, the tactics, the timing, the human fear behind the machinery. Like the video if you want this series to continue, and leave a comment telling me which theater you want next: Europe, Pacific, North Africa, or the Eastern Front, and what kind of moment you want us to reconstruct. A single duel, a desperate innovation, or a mission that changed doctrine. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.